The silence in this elevated desolation is not a mere absence of noise. It is a viscous, suffocating shroud that clings to the skin. It bears down with an oppressive, rhythmic pressure, a weight so absolute it threatens to collapse the very chambers of the inner ear. One can endure the stillness, perhaps even the feeling of being buried alive within the void. But do not be mistaken. It wasn't the crushing weight of the quiet that finally fractured my resolve. It was the melody, thin, rhythmic, and impossibly deliberate, that began to bleed out from the corner where the shadows are deepest. A tune that sounded less like music and more like an invitation from something that had been waiting for me to listen. My name is Elias, and unless you have stood amidst the bone-deep silence of Norland in the heart of January, you cannot truly grasp the meaning of isolation. It is a place where the sun forgets to rise, leaving behind a landscape of monochrome shadows and a cold that feels predatory. My parents had fled to Spain, seeking refuge from the iron grip of the freeze, leaving me as the sole inhabitant of the estate, a sprawling, ancient carcass of timber perched precariously on the lip of a pine forest so dense it seems to swallow the very light. It sits miles from the nearest pulse of civilization, a solitary sentinel in the dark. For a fortnight, the solitude was a comfort. I existed in a small artificial world of flickering screens and the low hum of the furnace, while the white void outside pressed against the glass like a physical weight. I would venture into town for my shifts, navigating the blinding veils of snow, only to return and bolt the heavy doors against the emptiness. I convinced myself I was secure within those walls. I told myself the silence was empty. That illusion shattered on a Tuesday. It started with the generator, a sudden rhythmic stutter that felt less like a mechanical failure and more like a dying pulse. And then the lights began to fail. I remained motionless, sunk into the hollow of the couch, bathed only in the flickering, spectral light of a silent television. It was that dead hour, 2 a.m., when the world feels thin and the shadows grow heavy. Outside, the wind performed its usual mournful keening against the eaves, a sound like a wounded animal that I'd long ago learned to tune out. But then, a new sound sliced through the gale. It was a whistle. It wasn't the erratic moan of air through a gap in the frame, nor the hollow sigh of the chimney. It was unmistakably, terrifyingly human. 3 distinct melodic notes, rising in pitch with a chilling, playful precision. The sound originated from the great bay window, mere inches behind the crown of my head. Only a thin, cold pane of glass separated my skull from the source. I froze, my pulse hammering against the silence as a primal chill bloomed at the base of my spine. My mind scrambled for a sanctuary of logic, an old pipe settling perhaps, or a stray branch brushing the glass, but the cadence was too deliberate, too rhythmic. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't an accident. It was a greeting, delivered by someone who knew exactly how thin that glass really was. The sound returned, shedding its previous subtlety. It was no longer a suggestion, but an assertion, a heavy, deliberate weight pressing against the exterior siding, as if something were leaning its entire mass against the thin, brittle barrier of my sanctuary. I silenced the television, and the sudden void was filled by the frantic, syncopated rhythm of my pulse. My heart did not merely beat, it thrashed against my ribs like a panicked creature sensing a predator through a cage. I attempted to shroud the moment in logic, telling myself that the crushing solitude was finally fracturing my mind. but the physical reality of the noise was impossible to dismiss. My fingers coiled around the cold, wrought iron of the fireplace poker, its weight a meager comfort against the growing dread. I moved toward the back door, the floorboards groaning under a tension that felt entirely too heavy for one person. When the latch finally gave way, the atmosphere didn't just shift, it struck. A violent, sub-zero void rushed in, 30 degrees below the freezing point of mercy. The air was thick and metallic, tasting of raw iron and ancient ice, as if the very night were trying to freeze the breath inside my lungs before I could scream. Somewhere in that darkness, I knew. I wasn't just looking into the night. The night was looking back. I crossed the threshold into the biting air, the porch boards groaning under the sudden weight. Below me, the snow lay heavy and suffocating, a vast white shroud that had claimed the earth, knee-deep and disturbingly smooth. The floodlight hummed with a sickly, rhythmic buzz, its pale glow dying long before it could reach the tree line. In that gray twilight, the shadows of the oaks stretched into long, skeletal fingers, clawing across the pristine expanse toward the house, as if trying to drag the very foundation into the dark. "Hello?" I offered the word to the night, but it was a brittle, fragile thing. The void didn't just ignore me, it seemed to swallow the sound whole, leaving a hollow space where my voice had been. No answer followed, only the wind, a low, mournful whistle that felt too much like a secret being whispered. I scanned the perimeter, my eyes aching against the white glare. The snow remained an unbroken sheet of glass, no footprints, no dragging trails, no sign of a living soul. To the north, the pines swayed with a rhythmic, unnatural grace, like silhouettes of mourners dancing in the dark. I stood there, shivering, gripped by a sudden, irrational shame. I felt foolish for my trembling hands, yet I could not shake the prickling sensation at the base of my neck, the distinct, cold certainty that something was watching me from the places where the light refused to go. I secured the threshold with a desperate, trembling precision, deadbolt, chain, and latch, until the wood groaned under the pressure. I moved from window to window, checking the locks twice, then thrice, as if mechanical brass could ward off an intrusion of the soul. The remainder of the night was spent in a state of suffocating hypervigilance, where every settling joist and cooling pipe sounded like a calculated footfall in the dark. You recognize that primal atavistic instinct, don't you? That frantic, breathless sprint of the basement stairs to outrun a shadow that hasn't quite touched you yet. There I was, a grown man of 20, fleeing my own hallway as if the air itself had teeth. The sound did not return, but the silence that followed was far more intrusive than any noise. The sensation of being observed did not fade. It took root. It was a localized chill, a prickling heat at the nape of my neck that suggested an unblinking gaze was boring through the very walls, or perhaps standing just inches behind me, waiting for me to turn around. 72 hours of hollow silence had almost allowed me to believe in my own delusions. I had begun to weave a fragile tapestry of logic, the rhythmic thrum of a laboring boiler, perhaps, or the frantic scuttle of a fox through the frozen brush. I was settling into the dangerous comfort of the mundane. Then came the night that dismantled me. I was submerged in that heavy, dreamless stupor that only comes when the mind finally stops looking for shadows. But the dark has a way of reclaiming its own. A sound, unbidden and viscous, began to drag me toward the surface of consciousness. It was a soft, rhythmic friction, the sound of something moist pressing, then peeling away from glass. Hiss. Hiss. My eyes didn't just open, they were summoned. The room was a void of ink, punctuated only by the clinical pale glare of the moonlight reflecting off the snow outside. It was a light that showed me the stillness of the furniture, but offered no comfort. The wet pressing stopped. In the sudden, suffocating vacuum of the room, the air seemed to thicken. Then the silence was violated by a familiar, lilting cadence, that melody, the whistle. It wasn't coming from the window. It wasn't coming from the hall. It was a breathy, vibrating trill, curling directly into the shell of my ear, right beside me. The air in the room had grown heavy, thick with an oppressive silence that seemed to squeeze the very breath from my lungs. My bed was wedged firmly against the cold plaster of the wall, positioned directly beneath the window, a thin glass veil between me and the outside world. I felt a primal urge to remain frozen, a desperate hope that if I didn't move, I wouldn't exist. All it would take was a slight, agonizing tilt of the head to see what lay beyond the pain. Every instinct I possessed screamed at me to keep my eyes fixed on the ceiling, but curiosity is a cruel master. I turned. A jagged silhouette had severed the moonlight, casting a long, rhythmic shadow across my sheets. A man stood anchored in the deep, virgin snow, tall, lanky, and impossibly still. He wasn't surveying the house or lost in the winter landscape. His focus was singular, a predatory gaze directed not at the room, but at the exact point where I lay. Then the true chill set in. A rhythmic, translucent plume of steam bloomed against the exterior of the glass, fading and reappearing with the steady cadence of his lungs. He wasn't just watching me from the yard. He was leaning in, his warmth mere inches from my face, separated only by a sheet of glass that suddenly felt far too fragile. He stood with a stillness that felt deliberate, an unnerving, statuesque rigidity that defied the natural sway of a living thing. He was simply there, an anchor in the dark. Yet his lips were pursed into a tight, unnatural circle. Then the sound returned. It was that same low, melancholic refrain, slow, rhythmic, and heavy with a grief that didn't belong to the living. The melody didn't just carry through the air, it shivered through the glass pane, a cold vibration that seemed to settle deep within my bones. As he tilted his head, his eyes seized the pale moonlight. They were wide, disturbingly so, fixed in a stare of feigned astonishment, as if he were the one surprised to find me there, despite having been the one curated in the shadows, watching. I recoiled in a frantic, clumsy retreat, the linen sheets becoming a snare around my legs as I tumbled from the bed. I felt the sharp intake of breath, the desperate urge to shatter the silence with a scream, but my throat had constricted into a dry, hollow knot. I was a prisoner of my own lungs, and all I could hear was the steady, vibrating pulse of that mournful tune. I stumbled into the narrow confines of the hallway, my fingers trembling as I forced them to dial Lucas's number. My breath came in ragged, wet hitches, fractured sounds of a terror I couldn't quite name. It took him 40 minutes to navigate the treacherous, glass-slick roads, an eternity spent listening to the house settle and groan around me. By the time he arrived, a heavy baseball bat gripped in his white-knuckled hand, the yard had returned to a hollow, mocking silence. We stood beneath my window, our breath blooming in the frigid air as we scanned the ground. The snow was a pristine, terrifying white, an unblemished shroud. There were no impressions, no heavy treads, no sign that anything living had stood there. The wind wailed then, a high, thin sound that seemed to scour the earth, perhaps erasing whatever had been watching me moments before. Or perhaps the rot wasn't in the yard, but behind my own eyes. We retreated inside to the dull glow of the kitchen. Lucas poured the whiskey, the amber liquid burning a path through the cold settling in my chest. He spoke of isolation, of the mind's cruel tendency to invent monsters in the silence, the cabin fever of a lonely winter. I let his words wash over me, nodding because the alternative was too heavy to carry. I wanted to believe him.
I desperately needed to believe that the prickling sensation on the back of my neck was merely my imagination, and not a gaze from the dark that had never truly left. Lucas departed with the first light of morning, and with him went the last shred of my composure. For a week, the house was draped in a thick, unnatural silence, a reprieve I desperately mistook for safety. But then, amidst the mundane clatter of porcelain in the kitchen sink, it returned. A whistle. It was a thin, reedy thing, threading its way through the rusted vents, or perhaps vibrating from deep within the hollow spaces of the walls. It was erratic, a capricious melody that refused to be predicted, appearing only when the air grew still enough to hear one's own heartbeat. I never saw his shadow again, yet his presence became a permanent fixture of the atmosphere. The sound didn't just haunt the rooms, it occupied them. Driven by a cold, prickling dread, I gathered my belongings and sought refuge in a town hostel, preferring the sterile company of strangers to the watchful eyes of my own home. I never uttered a word to my parents upon their return. Some truths are too heavy to share, and some memories too sharp to revisit. I will never set foot across that threshold alone again. I know now what I refused to see then. That house isn't vacant. It never was. I return to that house on occasion. Duty demands it. But I never allow the door to that room to close behind me. When the wind finally withers and the old wood stops its rhythmic shifting, the silence becomes heavy, almost tactile. It is in those breathless intervals that I find myself paralyzed, waiting, straining for that fourth note that refuses to manifest, yet haunts the air nonetheless. Tell me, have you ever heard so distinct, so undeniably there, that you felt the tether to your own sanity begin to fray? Or are you blessed with a silence you can actually trust? Share your shadows in the comments. And if you seek to remain here, in this fragile sanctuary against the dark, you know what is required.